Welcome to Stories of Impact. In every episode, we travel the world to explore intersections of science and spirituality. I'm your host, writer Tavia Gilbert, and along with journalist Richard Sergey, every first and third Tuesday, we look through a new lens at old traditions, hear from new generations as they dream up innovative solutions, and learn new ways to make sense of modern life. This is Stories of Impact, the art and science of human flourishing. Over the last several weeks, we've been focused on religious ritual as a pathway to human flourishing. And today we wrap up our enlightening series of conversations with Dr. Anna Corwin, who brings us to a powerful conclusion with her work examining what she calls spiritual expertise. Dr. Anna Corwin is an associate professor and chair of a women's spirituality program within the Religion and Philosophy Department at the California Institute of Integral Studies. But she's quick to point out that she's not a theologian. She's an anthropologist. It was when she was doing her postdoctoral work at Stanford that she became connected to the Diverse Intelligences Initiative, which longtime listeners to the Stories of Impact podcast will recognize as one of our favorite research communities. Diverse Intelligences researchers collaboratively examine the variety of intelligence on the planet and beyond, whether plant, animal, human, alien, artificial. And that made Dr. Corwin see new possibilities for her own unique scientific interest, which had been previously focused on the wisdom of Catholic nuns. Here's Dr. Corwin.
There's something about the way people are studying animals and slime molds and bees and everything that opens up our assumptions about what this creature is that we're studying. And I think as an anthropologist, that's also my approach. It seems quite clear that there are a tremendous number of human capacities that are not studied because of they're outside of the way that we think about cognition, which I think has to do with the particular history of how we think about what humans are and what science is. What is happening more broadly when we take away some of the assumptions that we've brought to the table. The community of scholars are interested in sort of paring back some of the assumptions that have clouded our science.
So Dr. Corwin was inspired to embark on a scientific exploration into spiritual intelligence.
I was interested in this particular kind of expertise that seems to be associated with spiritual practice. I became more and more interested in looking into what this thing was that was spiritual expertise or that seemed to be special, that emerged through it seemed to be some cognitive, social, linguistic kind of tools, patterns, skills that some people seem to have. There seem to be these experts.
So she designed a 3-year cross-cultural study to help her develop a framework of religious intelligence. The study was limited to Christianity, but designed to cover culturally vastly different places. The 4 study locations included an American convent with Franciscan Catholic nuns, a community of Greek Orthodox monks on Mount Athos, a charismatic Catholic community including lay folks in Uganda, and finally, missionized Catholic indigenous Runa from the Ecuadorian Amazon. Dr. Corwin's central question? What are the ways of knowing, perspectives, and capacities that arise through interaction with the divine? She wanted to understand.
What is religious intelligence in these 4 places? So it's a really humble question. What is it? What are people seeing? How will we see it? Will we see anything different about these people? What I'm up to is trying to understand how people on the ground who are living with these experts and recognizing them and treating them as spiritual experts in their community, how do they understand what religious intelligence is or what this expertise is? What are the impacts on the community of having people who are spiritual experts among them? What is the knowledge that's associated with this? What outcomes do they see?
Dr. Corwin's study included a survey, interview feedback, and video recording that allowed the scientists to explore what the spiritual experts' interactions actually looked like. One of the things that made it so unique, says Dr. Corwin, was
we asked people in the community to identify the expertise, and one of the goals of the grant was specifically to define what is an expert. Do other people look to these people? Who are the people who are looked to and are relied and are recognized for having certain capacities that others do not?
So, what did Dr. Corwin and her research team discover?
We found some really different things. We asked people what is absolutely required for somebody to be considered a spiritual expert in your community, meaning if they don't have this, you could not possibly be a spiritual expert. Among the Rumna folks, drinking medicinal plants, dreaming vividly, being able to heal people, being able to grow a beautiful garden and teaching others, these were absolutely required by 100% of the participants. And as you can maybe predict, these are different than what we find in a Catholic convent in the US. So in the US, we find that the things that were absolutely required included that folks were compassionate, that these women thought for themselves and were able to make their own decisions. Anyone who's sort of attentive to culture might notice that, that's maybe not so surprising that independent thinking might show up as important in a US context. Being able to forgive others, being able to help others, and being able to inspire the feeling of calm or peace in others were all really important in this US Catholic convent. So you can see just from those two that we have some real differences. Some folks might worry that having differences would be bad. Like, oh no, is there a thing that is religious intelligence? What if there's no thing here? There's no there. But I actually think this is extraordinarily important and makes an argument for why cross-cultural research is important. If I only looked at my US data, we would not be capturing what spiritual intelligence is for Ecuadorian Runa folks.
What were the similarities Dr. Corwin's research revealed among the spiritual experts?
There are still some real important cross-culture or cross-cutting conclusions. There is agreement across that these spiritual experts find solutions to things that others have not. Folks who are seen as experts in all of these places seem to have a skill of being able to shift their horizon of attention. So when there is a problem, the spiritual experts were able to deal with their own physical pain or a physical crisis with a particular robustness that showed up on well-being surveys and showed up in their health outcomes. And so it might be a health problem that they were able to shift to a larger horizon of attention that allowed them to live and thrive. And then we also see this in terms of solving social problems and resolving social tension. So we saw the shifting of horizon of attention and also the ability to resolve internal tension, but also social tension. So what we saw across all of these places is that these experts are people who the community would turn to.
Dr. Corwin found that spiritual experts worldwide could shift their horizon of attention in problems that were personal, such as a fight between a husband and wife or the loss of a limb, or social, such as a community-wide protest against an oil company responsible for an ongoing environmental crisis. Whatever the size of the problem, says Dr. Corwin.
Again, we see this ability to shift the horizon of attention from the kind of panic of this moment or the concern that is local to a much larger perspective, a bigger picture, and then also finding solutions that others haven't. And so this takes creativity, takes intertextual thinking, linking things that others maybe are not. It's the finding solutions, but then also modeling equanimity and acceptance of what is seems to be a huge component of this, having stability in addition to the problem solving.
Does Dr. Corwin think the word leader could be used in place of spiritual expert? Are they the same thing?
I think there's overlap, but I think actually there's also some non-overlap. I think that often these experts are quiet. They're often people who actually sit back and don't take leadership roles. And there were some things that we noticed that were quite similar in terms of body position and engagement, that these experts that we were following, who'd been identified by their community as spiritual experts, often in social settings or in communal settings, were quieter than others. They often made less eye contact. So they were not necessarily taking on leadership roles or guiding people. But when they made an intervention, which was rarer than others, it was listened to and it was effective. in a way that others weren't necessarily.
Were there any research findings that Dr. Corwin did not expect?
I think that I had a sense of what kind of internal states I would be expecting to see, that folks would be calm and that there would be kind of a peacefulness and a joy, kind of a almost stereotype of a holy person. And when we look cross-culturally, that's not always true. The folks who are identified in the Runa data are often seen also as dangerous and not always, they're sometimes viewed very, very positively. They're absolutely viewed as powerful, but they're not necessarily humble or compassionate or peaceful. Often, when we think about holy people or spiritual experts, we, in the US at least, I think often think about the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or folks who appear as peaceful and kind and loving. And I think one of the things that surprised me was the way that there was a directness, like a clarity that I saw from these people, these moments of just cutting to the bone. And then what was the other piece that was surprising and is absolutely part of this is that the spiritual experts also seem to not have an attachment to the outcome. So I occasionally saw them fail. I saw them sort of insert a possibility that could unpack it or dissolve the tension, and it didn't work. And what was interesting was I saw them accept that and sort of move on. Acceptance of what is part of how they're moving through these social interactions. It is not a forceful intervention. One of the things that surprised me the most was how much humor was part of the skill set that the experts brought. That these folks weren't always gentle or nice or kind, but that they moved through the environment so skillfully that they could sometimes tell a joke or say something funny that would actually change everyone's perspective. And so that piece, that humor was involved, was a big surprise for me.
What did the spiritual experts say was the source of their expertise?
We were looking at people, the majority of whom would say that this expertise is coming from their relationship with God. So if you ask a Catholic nun what is happening, she would say it's a connection with God, absolutely, and that is where that is coming from. If you ask a Runa person, they're going to talk also about spirits and spirits being involved in the knowledge and skills and guidance of themselves. So they will see themselves. And I think this is interesting on a few levels. I'm an anthropologist. It's very important to see, yes, that the communities are attributing this to a relationship with the divine. These experts are all people who spend a lot of time in prayer or a lot of time in relationship with the divine or spirit. When we look at experts in Taoism and in Buddhism, where there's writing about this, the literature is indicating that these similar threads exist within those experts who are, for example, Buddhist, who maybe would not be attributing their expertise to the divine. I want to sort of bring some openness to that question.
Though Dr. Corwin was at the helm of this study about Christian spiritual experts, as a non-Christian who was raised Jewish and studied Buddhism, she initially had skepticism about whether there was such a thing as a spiritual intelligence.
I came into the convent as an anthropologist, as a true outsider. I found my own bias, which was very much because of my own Euro-American kind of training and heritage. I went into this, if I'm honest, not being fully convinced that this was a thing. Howard Gardner, who famously writes about diverse intelligences, made the argument back in 2000 that spiritual intelligence isn't an intelligence, that it's not a thing that's distinct from other forms of intelligence. And honestly, when I started this, that's where I was. I have ended this study far more convinced, both of the cross-cultural diversity, but also that there is a human capacity, a set of skills that is not captured in the other ways that we're talking about intelligence or the other forms of intelligence.
But her experiences in the company of these experts and the findings of her research have changed her perspective.
And I encountered people, individuals in the convent. When I encountered them, I felt something. I could describe it as a feeling of calm or peace, of like, whew. And I could see people orient to these individuals. And what surprised me at that point was that it did not seem like these people had particularly more training. They did not hold necessarily leadership roles. They were not even necessarily all that charismatic. My vernacular at the time was like, wow, these people have really put aside their ego. They really are moving through the world as if the self is not the motivator. They're not reacting to the world as a self. They are responding as if they have sort of a larger perspective, like they're peaceful. My hunches were confirmed. These folks are shifting a horizon of attention that aligns with what I was originally seeing. But the things that have surprised me were the ways that these folks were able to intervene and find solutions. I absolutely experienced a sense of awe in the same way that I've sometimes experienced awe when I see virtuosity elsewhere. So when you see a violin performer who's incredible, I've felt awe. Like, wow, I couldn't do that. Or how did they do that? It was an awe at the skill that they had.
Dr. Corwin is eager to keep learning about spiritual expertise and to make her findings actionable.
The skills of shifting the horizon of attention, the skills of resolving internal and social tensions, these things are incredibly critically important. I think that this moment in the world is a really particularly ripe moment to be looking at spiritual intelligence, not because I have a particular religious or spiritual viewpoint, but because I think that the skill sets that we are seeing here are particularly useful for navigating large scale social change, social shifts. And we are at a moment, climate wise, we're at a moment in terms of the global political climate. There's a real potential fitness advantage to the kind of skills that we see lining up with how folks are understanding religious intelligence. I'm not leaving this study with the idea that we should all become spiritual experts. Just like I don't think we should all become virtuoso musicians. I think then nobody would be doing all the other things that society needs us to do. But I do think that this skill set that comes with this form of expertise can be particularly useful for social groups who are navigating very, very different large-scale social problems.
Further research into spiritual intelligence will help scientists better understand how people can thrive, says Dr. Corwin. And that's not just a nice idea, but vital for the future of humanity.
I have a hypothesis that an Abrahamic God is not the sort of central thing, but rather the skill sets that come through particular practices. And I would love to get funding and work collaboratively with folks to do this study that's not just cross-cultural, but also cross-religions, to really hone in on what are the skills, how are they being trained, and then what is happening in communities that have spiritual experts, and can we measure the kinds of outcomes in a more refined way in other religious cultural contexts as well. If we want to understand humans, I mean, we are a remarkable species. We're a very bizarre species in that we have, we live all over the globe. We are remarkably flexible. We do things that many other species can't do. We also may be setting ourselves up for our own demise. Like there's a lot that's really interesting and a little bit weird about humans as a species. And I think if we have the goal to understand any species, all species on Earth, but in particular humans ourselves, I think if we don't look at these particular skills, we're not going to understand ourselves. I mean, these seem to be skills that help people manage social catastrophe and also individual catastrophe, like cancer or illness or aging. I think that it's a way in which, if we really want to understand ourselves as a species, and if we want to continue to thrive and flourish, I think it's an area that really deserves a lot more attention.
We'll be back with more research at the intersection of spirituality and science in our next new episode. In the meantime, we'd love it if you'd recommend us to a friend, give us a 5-star rating, or leave a great review. And it'd be great to hear from you. Reach out through storiesofimpact.org or on Instagram, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, or Facebook. This has been the Stories of Impact podcast with interviews by Richard Sergey. Written and produced by Tavia Gilbert for Talkbox Productions. Assistant producer Oscar Falk. Music by Alexander Filipiak. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Executive producer Michelle Cobb. The Stories of Impact podcast is generously supported by Templeton World Charity Foundation.